As usual, another great guest, but a quick diversion. You'll notice that our full name is the Marketplace for Health, Wealth, and Freedom. Well, let's talk about your health for a moment. If you'd like to escape from the stranglehold of insurance and be able to see alternative doctors or go across state lines for care, then you definitely need to take a look at patientempowerment.mpb.health and see if that's the fix you've been looking for. Now, let's get back to the show.
Welcome, folks. Charlie Froman here with co-host Jim Graypeck. Very excited to discuss the old right with Jeff Deist, my old friend from the Ron Paul days. What makes this issue important to me is sort of the similar dynamic between the 30s and now. And Jeff may agree or disagree. He's going to ramble for as long as he wants on this. But it has to do with a word I know he didn't like in my promo email, the impotence of intellectuals in the face of tyranny. This morning on Facebook, I advertised folks to come join the discussion. We had great arguments over the past 2 years, yet the powers that be were able to exploit fear and just run roughshod with the draconian orders. I think this article from Mises, where Jeff's the president, from Rothbard. And as an aside, when I left lobbying to become a teacher in DC's inner city and get my master's, I realized as a libertarian, I had an advantage over most of my fellow teachers. The liberty versus power context really simplifies things. You just go to Mises, you Google, you search whatever you're looking for. Usually you end up with a Rothbard article. He's done all the research and the hard work and really lays it out. And he does so here with this topic, the old right. Even back then, they had the intellectual firepower. Albert Jay Nock, how can you go wrong with him? H.L. Mencken, whose biography I read, 20 years ago. And that really got me into the fun topic of teaching liberty through literature. And these journalists like Garet Garrett, or Garet Garrett, people argue how you pronounce his name, John Flynn. And my co-host Jim, though, has a little snippet here he wants to share to help the context. Go ahead, Jim. You got to unmute yourself.
So yeah, my food for thought today does have to do with economics. A few years back, I learned of the Slow Money Institute. It caught my attention. They're a Colorado-based nonprofit dedicated to, quote, capitalizing the flow of capital to local food systems, to the places where they live, promoting new principles of fiduciary responsibility that bring money back down to earth, as they say, and to transitioning from an era of making a killing to making a healthy living. It seems to me they're onto something. After 2 years now of this global tyranny, what I'm seeing is that there's more decentralization starting to occur. People are coming together, forming like-minded communities. More people are interested in local agriculture. So my question is, isn't it time to move away from focusing on things like GDP growth and the employment numbers, and to measure social and environmental outcomes that look at well-being and quality of life as the main indicators of how well we're doing? I'll close with something I heard recently that caught my attention, which was in the near, and this is a little more out there, but in the near future, your abundance will be linked to the frequency of your heart. While I don't think this will be a future economic metric, wouldn't it be nice if this grew into a key metric for humanity? And that's my food for thought. Thank you. Back to you, Charlie.
Thank you, Jim. And if folks don't know by now, we like to push the envelope on the topic, and it sets a tone for future guests. And it might have part to do with the solution out of today's topic, in that, how can we win the real world race from our intellectual firepower? And maybe it does have to do with new criteria on what makes an economy or a society flourishing. So Jeff, as I mentioned earlier, someone I knew from the Ron Paul days. He was his press secretary and then chief of staff. Before that, he was a lawyer. And now he is the president of the Mises Institute, which is the premier think tank for libertarianism in the world. I say that as an alumnus of the Cato Institute, where I was the government affairs associate director. Cato has its use, its prowess in various ways, and so does Mises, the more the merrier. But Jeff, let's talk about the old right and the article there that folks can look at. It was tragic in my mind. You had Nock, Mencken, Garrett doing what they could to stave off the changing of our world with the New Deal and World War. And now we have great thinkers, including Ron Paul, frontline doctors, independent press like Alex Berenson and others. We're slowly recovering in this COVID hysteria, but we're not out of the crosshairs of the Great Reset. So we need a good discussion today. Jeff, take it away.
Well, I think you're right that intellectual firepower is not enough. And if you look at the leading figures of the old right, and I would consider Rothbard not necessarily part and parcel of the old right simply because he was a generation younger, if not 2 generations younger than many of the main players. Nonetheless, there was also a populist or pugnacious element to Mencken, certainly to Rothbard, which I think we can learn something from and maybe apply today. So the old right is a topic that fascinates me in particular. And I guess the question we can start with is, why would we even go looking for a political tradition? And in other words, a lot of us came up through libertarianism or anarchism through the usual channels. I know that Charlie and I are of similar age. So for us, it was things like Reason Magazine. Ayn Rand was an influence in my teenage years. Fortunately, I had an older brother and a father who were reading things like The Road to Serfdom. And so through libertarianism, which I now consider somewhat of, I almost consider one of Orwell's meaningless words. In other words, words that have been vitiated of meaning because they've been used in consciously dishonest ways for so long. They're repurposed in a sense. So I'm not really happy with that word any longer. That's a different discussion. But the old right has certainly libertarian bona fides, which we should consider. Really a forerunner to Rothbardianism in many ways. But coming through libertarianism and then beginning to read Rothbard, a lot of us read The Ethics of Liberty or For New Liberty. A lot of us were introduced to thinkers like Lysander Spooner, to Morris and Linda Tannehill, who had their Market for Liberty book several decades ago, which really sort of presaged David Friedman's book, The Machinery of Freedom, in some ways. So some of us were introduced to Hoppe, the idea that not only from Rothbard that there's a normative justification for a laissez-faire, complete laissez-faire, a stateless system, but there's even perhaps an argumentative justification. We came up through the attacks on democracy from Hoppe and others. So a lot of us are coming from this background of libertarianism or even anarcho-capitalism. And so even though there are historic precedents there, which Rothbard has written about over the years, Lao Tzu in Asia, the levelers in the UK, in today's UK, the leveler movement. But if we think about anarchism in at least the 20th century conception, which really comes out of the 19th, anarchism has, for most people, left-wing connotations, being anti-monarchical. In other words, upsetting the old European order. And so that's probably conceptually sound to say that impulse comes from the left. And certainly for Ludwig von Mises, one of his big problems with Murray Rothbard was anarchism, because for someone born in the late 1800s and living through the 2 world wars, anarchism was seen as a bomb throwing or a destructive or left-wing movement. So, fast forward to the mid to late 20th century, those of us who considered anarcho-capitalism, probably have more of a right-wing flavor in many people's minds, but nonetheless, it's certainly an anti-political tradition. And so why do we need a political tradition at all? Especially one which was, at least according to Rothbard, short-lived as the old right, which has really basically had its heyday from the 1920s to the 1950s. So although it's rooted in older animating impulses of, even Jefferson and Locke, nonetheless, as a purely political tradition, it's relatively recent, it's relatively short-lived. So why should anarchists or libertarians want to identify with it? I guess for me anyway, speaking only for myself, there's something satisfying about knowing that there were serious intellectuals who shared a perspective very similar to our own, and who actually had some political traction, however brief and shining, right? Because today we tend to feel very jaded about politics, very hopeless. The right seems to be veering into jingoism. The left seems to be veering into tyranny. So to know that there are people in the past that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, I think gives us some optimism and some hope. And it's funny that throughout the 2015, 2016, when Hillary Clinton and others were making up this word, this phrase, the alt-right, which was supposed to be this big scary thing. Of course, the alt-left controls everything at your kid's school, but nevertheless, the alt-right, for those of us who had German-speaking grandmothers in their household when we were little, alt means old in German. So every time I heard alt-right, I was thinking old right, wait a minute. So in Rothbard's definition, I'm going to refer to my notes here, what is the old right? How can we define it? Well, there are some things it was definitely for. The old right was for property rights in a very vigorous way, in ways that I think today's right doesn't come close. And also the old right was very much for a sound money standard, presumably gold, but at least a sound form of currency not easily controlled by central banks or central governments. But beyond that, the old right is very much identified by what it was against. And so as libertarians or liberty-minded people, we sometimes identify with that. It feels sometimes like we're against everything, but what are we for? Because liberty is a very amorphous concept. And once you accept a more left-wing definition of positive rights, it basically becomes meaningless. So like modern day libertarians, the old right from the 20s to the 50s was against a lot of things. It was against empire. So it was pro-republic. And that's a very, a serious distinction, which starts to take very definite form during the Cold War and during the Eisenhower years. It was against the Wilsonian program of central banking and income taxes. Later on, it was against, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan coming out of World War II. And perhaps more than anything else, it was against and opposed to the New Deal programs of the 1930s, which, as we shall see, really reimagined government as a managerial state rather than one run by Congress or run by any particular president. So if we take that as a broad definition of the old right, we could say that it stands for the idea of republic, not empire. And I think that's something that a lot of us can share and understand as well. So Charlie mentioned some of the leading figures in the old right. One figure who often goes unannounced is Howard Buffett. Howard Buffett was a congressman from Omaha, Nebraska, for about 10 years in the 1940s and 50s. He is, of course, the father of the more famous Warren Buffett. And Howard Buffett was very much a patron of the old right. He became wealthy, somewhat wealthy later on in his own investing practice. But perhaps most interestingly are two things: that he actually stepped away from investing for a while to be the campaign manager for Robert Taft's 1952 presidential primary run against Dwight Eisenhower. And that was actually pretty closely contested. And Taft had a real shot at winning that. And Taft, of course, is one of the political leading figures of the old right. If we think about the what ifs, what if Robert Taft had defeated Eisenhower and then become president in the general election. Well, I'm not sure what that would have yielded, because unfortunately he died of very aggressive cancer just a year or so later in 1953 as the Senate Majority Leader in Washington, D.C. So, Robert Taft is held up as an avatar and an example, I think, of someone, even with our political tradition, our viewpoints can get as far as almost defeating Eisenhower in a presidential primary. But apart from that, I have some wonderful correspondence. We have a bunch of letters from the 60s, correspondence between Murray Rothbard and Howard Buffett. So unlike the much worse Warren Buffett, Howard Buffett was a gold standard guy. He was a big fan of Rothbard. And here, the letter I'm looking at here is from July 31st, 1962. And Howard Buffett is saying, "Thank you for sending me an advanced copy of Man, Economy, and State." And that's a book, really his ultimate economics treatise, which Rothbard worked on throughout the 50s. It's a 900-page thick book. And to think that back then a congressman or a businessman would be reading that sort of thing and corresponding with Rothbard on, a pretty dense, difficult read. I'm not an economist, so that book I personally find difficult, much harder than Human Action, for example. It just shows you sort of the intellectual level that people were working at the time. So I think Howard Buffett is a fascinating figure in U.S. history, albeit a minor one. And you just wonder what some of these turning points might have been if things had gone a little differently. So anyway, he was a thoroughgoing fan of Rothbard, which strikes me as fascinating. But one thing that stands out about the period of the old right in particular is, again, the intellectual level and the literary traditions of it all. I mean, people today may not understand when you look at like the Atlantic, which used to be called the Atlantic Monthly. I mean, just absolute garbage. Not just in the sense that it's statist and wrong, but in the sense that it has very poorly written, non-intellectual tripe. But the Atlantic Monthly used to publish Albert J. Nock in the 1920s. As recently as I believe it was 1945, folks, a condensed version of Hayek's Road to Serfdom was published in Reader's Digest. I mean, Reader's Digest is like TV Guide. That's a very mainstream, middle of the road publication coming into American homes. So, just as recently as 1945, this is the kind of thing that average Americans are reading. So we really have had a marked intellectual decline in this country, and I think that's really been tragic, because I think there's almost a stridency today. There's almost an anti-intellectual tenor to our public square on social media, and certainly to our political world. And I think that's to our detriment. I'm a populist in the sense that I think elites have screwed everything up and they deserve our opposition. But it's not so much that I'm anti-elite per se. I just think we have the wrong elites. I think elite influence is inescapable in any society. And so we just have the wrong ones. So I thought that the best way to sum up the old right would be to just give a few thoughts on 3 or 4 of its leading figures and what we can take away from them as individuals. So we might as well start with Knock, the aforementioned Knock, who was a longtime colleague of the great H.L. Mencken. So Knock, I think what we can take from Albert J. Nock as both a literary and political thinker is the idea that of quietude rather than quietism. And there's a difference. Quietude is perhaps more of an internal sense of acceptance and equilibrium, whereas quietism is sort of shrinking from society, saying, well, it's hopeless. We can't win these political wars. The COVID regime is cracking down, and you're going to have a vaccine passport to get on an airplane. And what can we do? I'm just going to go off and live in the woods somewhere and keep my head buried in the sand until I die. That's quietism. Whereas quietude, I think, is more of a feeling that we control what we can control. And that's certainly what Knock thought. And so Knock is a huge influence on later Rothbard, because he writes Our Enemy, the State in 1922. And this is basically a hardcore ANCAP primer in the 20s, folks. And he's drafting off the idea of the German sociologist Franz Oppenheimer and saying, you know, Oppenheimer said there's basically two ways to organize society, the political means and the economic means. And so what, you know, those of us on this call would see the economic means are the voluntary things where we get together and cooperate for mutual benefit, versus the political means, by definition, at least imply, if not use, force and guns and prisons and militaries. And so Knock takes this a little further and says, you know, by looking at this, and let's, you know, in the 1920s, writing a book called Our Enemy, the State, that's pretty hardcore. And he basically says, you know, there's really no justification for the state, because in every area of life, the political means is morally, ethically invalid, because it requires force. And, you know, force in anything other than self-defense is illegitimate. So quite an important book, and had quite an effect on Rothbard. So as I mentioned earlier, you know, Albert Jay Nock wrote in Atlantic Monthly, and his famous article, which appeared there, was Isaiah's Job in the 1930s. I don't recall the date. So Isaiah's Job is the essay where he identifies the remnant. He says, you know, there is a group of people out there, a cadre of people. They're not a majority, but they don't need to be. They just need to be influential. And these are the people who still have a concept of an intellectual tradition, but more importantly, of the old republic versus an empire. And so he says, our job is to identify them and foster them and hopefully push them to the fore, rather than some sort of majoritarian numbers game. And I think we can take a lot of comfort in that, because it seems awfully hard. You know, you want somebody to be the next president, let's say. Well, you know, that takes 80 million votes roughly at this point. That's a pretty big enchilada. Whereas this idea of a remnant is again, not quietism, not retreatism, but quietude, the idea that we can only reach those whom we can reach. And that's plenty. I mean, even 10% of Americans is 30 million people. I mean, that's larger than probably half of the European countries. I mean, that's a pretty significant force. So from Knock, we get Quietude. Garet Garrett. I've always heard it pronounced Garet Garrett. That's his pen name. Garet Garrett was a very influential writer and thinker and essayist and intellectual in the 1920s and 30s. But what we get from Garrett is, I think, a clear-eyed honesty. In other words, the willingness to look at our situation, to look at the world, to look at majority opinion, and especially to look at government for what it truly is, and to jettison any of these old, silly ideas we might have of constitutionalism or the rule of law or the separation of powers. All those things are in the rearview mirror, according to Garet Garrett. And what I would recommend to people, a great weekend read, pretty short essay, is called The Revolution Was. And this came out in 1938. So this essay talks about what happened in the 1930s, in particular, under FDR and the New Deal. And so what Garrett points out, and this is something I've often considered in my own life, is that sometimes revolutions occur, he calls it within the form. In other words, no shots are fired, there's no coup, we don't have a group of armed people who come in and take a government or a government leader out of power and replace him or her with another. You know, there's no uprisings in the streets, there's no tanks, but there's a quiet revolution, and a revolution which takes place within the form. And within the form, by what Garrett means within the form, he's like, well, you know, we still have a federal government sharing powers with state government. We still have a Congress, a House and Senate. We still have a Supreme Court. We still have a president. We still have the executive agencies. We still have the Constitution and all these supposed ideas and legalisms within it. But what we don't have is the substance anymore. So what the 1930s did, for example, according to Garrett, was it took a bunch of really rugged individuals, self-employed farmers, right? We forget that up until really well into even the the 20th century, but certainly through most of the 19th, the vast majority of Americans worked and lived in agricultural settings rather than factory or city settings. And farmers were pretty much self-employed. So that made them a more libertarian constituency in a sense. They were business owners, even if that was just them. Whereas one of the great accomplishments, sick as it may have been, of the 1930s was to introduce agricultural subsidies to farmers, ostensibly to help them survive the ravages of the Great Depression and the collapse in commodity prices. But what it really did was it created a whole new constituency of farm subsidies and entitlements for farmers. And so that radically transformed a bunch of rugged, self-independent people who could, survive the Depression almost by what they produced on their own farms without money, into people who were dependent on and clamoring for more ag subsidies. So that's a tragedy. What the 1930s gave us and what Roosevelt gave us was, of course, Social Security, which again created a middle-class entitlement constituency, which had never existed before. An old age pension was just something that people had never even thought of. So again, average people clamoring for something from government. But more importantly, the managerial state, which today maybe we call the deep state, but it's not deep. It's right in front of us in the form of the administrative agencies, which basically operate unimpeded. Presidential administrations come and go, but 80% of them, federal unionized employees, by the way, just sit there and do what they want. And every once in a while, some beleaguered citizen sues them for overreach. That's great if you've got 10 years and $10 million for lawyers. But for most people, when we say the government, what we mean is the federal administrative agencies, the bureaucratic state, not the president, not Congress, not the Supreme Court, not your mayor. That's what the government is today. So this is something that Garet Garrett pointed out in his essay, The Revolution Was. He says this happened under our noses. It happened within the form. And I want to find this great quote from him because it's pretty chilling. I'm quoting him from this essay, 1938, The Revolution Was. He says, "You do not defend a world that is already lost." When was it lost? That you cannot say precisely. It is a point for the revolutionary historian to ponder. We only know that it was surrendered peacefully without a struggle, most unawares. There was no day, no hour, no celebration of the event. And yet definitely the ultimate power of initiative did pass from the hands of private enterprise to government. So, it sounds a little depressing and it sounds a little pessimistic, but I think in a sense, being clear-eyed helps us. I think it gives us an opportunity to say, forget this idea of restoring something in America, return to constitutional principles, make America great again, all this kind of sloganeering. As liberty-minded people, we have to be forward-looking. We have to understand that the great American tradition of independence or freedom was always a little hazy, to be fair, and it's gone. And so, we start with that. So Garrett is someone who really is helpful to us in understanding the left's success. The left was able, the progressives, and I consider plenty of people on the right as progressives as well. The progressives were able to capture the managerial state and wield it to their ends. And so that's what we take from Garrett. Henry Hazlitt, another figure not often necessarily associated with the old right, but what we get from Hazlitt is that journalism skillfully done beats academia or ideology or intellectualism any day. Because Henry Hazlitt was a journalist. He was self-taught. He didn't go to college. He was an orphan kid who spent a year or so in the World War I U.S. Army Air Corps, got out penniless, went and looked for a job, saw a want ad for the Wall Street Journal, a fledgling publication at the time, and saw that secretaries got paid more than the other jobs he was looking for. So he taught himself to type quickly and went and started typing. He was a typist, the Wall Street Journal, but through that, he started absorbing economics and business reporting and eventually worked his way up in that august publication. So he was very much an aristocratic guy, a self-made man, became actually quite wealthy, investing on his own, and lived all the way until the 1990s. And I don't think I don't mind saying he left a very large sum of money to the Mises Institute in his will, and that helped us build our first building in the 1990s. So Henry Hazlitt was really something. I mean, really a force of nature, dressed very beautifully, very well spoken. You would think he'd come from money. He came from anything but. But he, by his own estimation, he wrote, in addition to, of course, we all know Economics in One Lesson as his great lay-friendly book, but in his own estimation, he wrote 10 million words. And, he was an editor at the Wall Street Journal. He had a column in the New York Times for years. He had a long-running column in Newsweek called Business Tides. Okay, he explained inflation. He even wrote some novels. I mean, this guy was so prolific, such a force of nature. And if he had been doing all this in an academic setting or a more egghead intellectual setting, he would never have had the impact he had. So when we think of, the impact of Hazlitt, it's, to be fair, far larger than the impact of a Mises, for example, because of the setting. So today's version of Hazlitt, who would that be? I don't know. I wish it were, a John Tamny, a guy I like and admire at Forbes and Real Clear Markets, for example, a real business writer. I don't always agree with him, but I love him. Someone like that. But even social media people, Charlie mentioned Alex Berenson, people like that who are out there in today's media. That might even be memes. Okay, Hazlitt worked with the media of his time, and that was journalistic column writing. And as a result, he had a far greater impact than I think the intellectual world did. And as a really neat aside, he was a good man. He helped Mises a lot when he got here. He got Mises opportunities to write articles for the New York Times at the time, and Mises got $10 a pop. Because Mises had no money upon arrival, so people like Hazlitt helped him, and I think that's a sweet story. Finally, I think we need to talk about H.L. Mencken. What can we get from Mencken? I see we're already 37 minutes in, so I'll wrap up with Mencken, and then Charlie, if there's any questions, I don't want to go too long, but what can we take from Mencken? Well, where do you even start? I mean, such a force of nature. I would be willing to wager that his word count rivaled that of Hazlitt's 10 millions. I mean, a prolific guy. And this was back when journalists and writers were really hard boiled. I mean, they had to sit down in front of a typewriter and produce. They couldn't just research, at their fingertips with the internet. They had to use typing paper, and I don't know if they had whiteout or whatever, but they had to type it up themselves, which was more of a physical endeavor. So what we can take from Mencken is, I think, first and foremost, that there's something to be said for a literary and intellectual tradition. I mean, as acerbic and elitist and hard-boiled as Mencken was, I mean, he was a literary figure, like Knock was. He started the American Mercury, which was a literary publication. Hazlitt later became the editor of that after Mencken left, actually, but had a falling out with the publishers over content, and only lasted a few issues. But I mean, this was real literature. And I mentioned Knock earlier. He started the Freeman. We think of that as a fee, a Foundation for Economic Education publication. But prior to that, it was started by Knock and others. And I mean, despite having economics, I mean, the old issues of the Freeman, well up through the 50s and 60s, were just unbelievably beautiful and literary, really. So the idea that economics and politics are sort of one rigid area, and over here is literature and culture and arts and beauty and the written and spoken word, and that the twain shall meet, that's wrong. We should embrace the idea of a more wholesale or broad intellectualism, because these writers back in the day, Rose Wilder Lane, Isabel Patterson, they were capable of writing literature and poetry, but also writing about politics and economics. They were more broad-minded than us. Today, any economist trying to write anything literary today would be just derided and told to stay in their lane. I think that's a mistake. So the idea of an intellectual tradition, and of course, Mencken was a master of language. He wrote this massive 2-volume thing called The American Language, which is all about usage and just absolutely beautiful history of the English language and some of its derivations and bastardizations. And I mean, what an accomplishment. I mean, that would be a lifetime's work for any intellectual, but it's only a minor part of his output. And of course, Mencken was not afraid of muckraking at the Baltimore Sun or otherwise. He wasn't afraid of really, despite his intellectualism, of really lambasting politicians and religious phonies and movements and do-gooders and reformers like John Dewey, hated by Rothbard as well. I mean, he was really pugnacious and, hard drinking guy, smoked cigars. He wasn't, some physically shrinking guy. And you really get that if you read his writings on his childhood in Baltimore around the turn of the century. Mencken had a sense of place. And I think oftentimes because we live in such a digital space in our heads today and social media and otherwise, we're online all day, we forget about that sense of place. And a lot of libertarians, I think, veer, unfortunately, into universalism and globalism, which I think is a mistake. I think a sense of place is really important. And Mencken had that. He loved his childhood Baltimore. He writes about it extensively, running around in the streets, and everything was horse-drawn carriages. All the fancy houses in Baltimore, even they have a stable house separate from the main house, and then that covered area where you pull your horse and buggy through in case it's raining. So all the horse manure in the streets. He talks about the cobwebs which they'd run through everywhere. He talks about the immense protein factory of the Chesapeake Bay. Poor people could go down to the Chesapeake and pull crab out of the bay, and eat and have something to eat in buckets. So he really has these wonderful childhood reminiscences, and he talks about drinking a lot. He talks about bars and pubs a lot. So this sort of muckraking, pugnacious side of Mencken, he wasn't an effete intellectual, and he wasn't what Rothbard called the Luftmenschen, the people of the air. And I get it. I have a really terrible sense that's one of the big problems in libertarianism today, is this Luftmenschen syndrome. So, Mencken is an absolute monster. You could spend, he's got 4 or 5 biographers, serious biographers. You could spend a lifetime just studying Mencken and reading his stuff like you could with Rothbard. These people were very prolific. So I'll just sum it up with this. Rothbard used this great term, Tory anarchism, to describe Mencken and also Knock. And so Tory anarchism is just a really beautiful, delicious combination. I think Dan McCarthy of ISI, the American Conservative, uses that as his Twitter handle. So Tory anarchism implies sort of like the elitism and the intellectualism of the Tories in Britain, but the anarchism and the bomb throwing and the hostility to the state in any form of Knock and later Rothbard. So if you ever needed a descriptive phrase for the old right or a figure of the old right, would be a Tory anarchist. And I think that's something to which we should all aspire. So that said, Charlie, I want to thank you for this opportunity. This is really fun for me to go back and review my notes on this and to have the privilege of living a few hours in the minds of these much better thinkers and writers than most of us. So that said, I'll send it back to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Jeff. And I don't know if other folks had the experience I had, who became really, dedicated libertarians and advocates for the cause, but it must have been 20 years ago. Again, who really knows when it actually was, but I ended up in my apartment in Northwest DC going through a reading phase. And it must have extended longer than that, but I know in detail everything you're talking about. For example, Knock's Quietism, one could say that stems actually back to Lao Tzu and Taoism, because he also talked about a quietism. And I think you describe it really nicely, where it's not about shrinking, it's about having that inner fortitude to do Isaiah's job for the remnant. That was fantastic. I also liked your emphasis on Mencken's teaching liberty through literature, which is a favorite dynamic of mine. I think we both know Professor Cantor at UVA he's got that famous book. I'm not sure what the title is, but basically it's, using stories to teach political economy. And I think Mencken is good for that, because if you read those biographies, like Carl Bodie was one of the earlier ones I read a long time ago. If you were ever lazy, like maybe I was and others were in AP English, and you didn't quite read those books that you're supposed to, Mencken makes it easy for you. He tells you, read Theodore Dreiser, read Joseph Conrad, read Sinclair Lewis. And if you do, you understand why Mencken liked them. They describe the harsh reality of nature, the real corruption of the do-gooders. So that's been my dream, being a social studies teacher a long time ago, is if I ever went back to teach school, I would want to teach political economy through literature and use those authors. Garet Garrett as well. He has a lot of good stories. He has a good history book I'll recommend, An American Story, where he goes into the 40s. So he wrote it sometime in the 40s. That's a great short history of America. So this is just fantastic. I share your joy for this topic. Those are the best writers. Albert Jay Nock, his biography of Jefferson, Mr. Jefferson, is fantastic. And I see we have Professor Sabrin with his hand up. So folks, just click the raise hand icon and let's discuss this love we all probably should have for the old right intellectuals. Unmute yourself, Murray, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Jeff. Good seeing you. Hope to see you on Saturday in Tampa.
Yes.
Anyway, I have a quick question. 2014 was the 60th anniversary of Frank Chodorov's wonderful little booklet, The Income Tax Root of All Evil. And I hosted a symposium at the college at the time. What was the impact of Chodorov on the old right movement, given his, terrific criticism of the income tax?
Well, I know that for a period, he had a salutary impact on William F. Buckley, as did Baldy Harper. But then, unfortunately, the income tax has clearly been one of the worst forms of ruin in American history, because it's not so much just the money, it's the invasiveness of it. I mean, we see today, Murray, in 2020, they spent, in fiscal 2020, they spent $7 trillion. They only brought in 3.5. So the question is, if 50% of everything FedGov does can be done with debt, why can't 80% or 90% or 100%? So it's definitely a form of control. And more importantly, I think it's a form of spying. You got to give them so much information. But unfortunately, Chodorov's vision did not end up being National Review's vision. And so when we think what happened to the old right, what happened in the 50s, it was a variety of things. It was the aforementioned Wilson doctrine. It was the Marshall Plan. It was the Cold Warriorism, the pro-NATO, pro-UN types like Eisenhower. And then defeating the Soviets became the cause célèbre of the right, rather than defending property rights and individualism. And so, if you read Roth, if all the time you have in life is just to read this, that's plenty about the old right, the betrayal of the American right. It's a pretty short book. You can actually read this over a weekend, about 200 pages thereabouts. Is to say, it really was the Cold War and National Review and Buckley. That's really what put the nail in the coffin of the old right. And Rothbard goes so far as to allege, not definitively, but possibly, that that National Review was from its start basically a CIA operation. And that's something that Baldy Harper and Chodorov would have, of course, rejected in total.
And folks, on the screen, I'm sharing the 3 paragraphs Mises wrote to summarize Rothbard's classic, and that pretty much bookends that short-lived period, as Jeff describes it. Fantastic thinkers, very difficult to overcome the New Deal managerial takeover of our government, and tragic how, despite Taft's great efforts, basically the Cold Warriors kind of took it over with Buckley. And Chodorov was also one of those lone wolves during that time, with a great series of articles until the libertarian movement kind of expanded I don't know, when do we kind of gain traction? That's hard to say too. That's another topic. Maybe the Ron Paul race of 2008, when it really expanded. Dave, you got your hand up? Go ahead.
Yeah, is a really interesting topic. My question relates to this notion of a remnant and knock, and basically, we have seen let's call it the remnant strengthen in recent years and grow, but at the same time, it's a very distinct minority, and without any real political power. And it got me to thinking, though, that just over the last year or two, we've had a lot more sort of mainstream type folks who are kind of waking up to liberty and appreciating its importance, and becoming more active. And and if we didn't have the people let's call them the remnants, doing all the hard work for all of the years before then, you know we wouldn't have had, they wouldn't have had sort of a core to build upon. So I don't know, I'd just like to get your thoughts on that.
Well, thank God we have the core. I mean, if a young person, by young in politics is 40 or whatever, but let's just make sure they're reading Knock and Mencken and Rothbard, and not Sean Hannity or something, right? I'm biased here. I think that we only have so much time and resources. So we have to identify people who are not only most receptive to our message, but also people with some juice in society. People who can, go out there and actually, people with money, people with businesses, people with cultural or political or economic influence, right? So that's what the left has done so well. They were able to leverage celebrities and wealthy people to their causes, even when those causes were, as a percentage of the population, distinctly minority causes. And we just haven't had that leverage, because I think people who think like us keep quiet. And we've even seen some Silicon Valley rich folks get doxxed for having given money to this trucker thing, right? And so in Silicon Valley, that's probably not a good thing to give money to. So it starts, I think, it starts with the courage, and starts with a few people standing up. And I think it takes a sense that the status quo is unsustainable and crumbling. In other words, if people feel like they still have a lot to lose, then they're not going to probably change the status quo. But when people start to see the kind of inflation we're seeing, when people start to see that our foreign policy is absolutely insane and purposeless and worse, they start to see government totally mismanage COVID the way it mismanaged Afghanistan. I hate to say, but it's human nature. We'll be comfortable as long as we can be. It's only when things start to look shaky and things don't work. But when that day comes, and as that day comes, again, this is a period. A revolution can happen over decades. We need to be there with the literature, right? We need to be there winning hearts and minds, and we need our Hazlitt. Charlie, I'm taking. Who's today's Hazlitt? That's what I want to know.
Well, I'm glad I mentioned Berenson earlier, because I'm stumped like you. It might be like a Jeffrey Tucker at the Brownstone Institute, which is more specialist. He wants to focus on libertarian public health. He's got some good epidemiologists there, Jay Bhattacharya. You mentioned John Tamny. I've had him on at least once a year ago. He writes well, like you said, at Forbes. A lot of folks, like I mentioned earlier too, are still scared of various third rails. Vaccines are, less scary to people, to really tackle the corruption there, the CDC and the government and pharma capture. Telecom wireless is the next one. There's others that folks don't want to touch. The remnant's going to have to be strong, have a strong stomach for what's coming with these great reset elitists and globalists. I think your local land connection is something we have to confront and realize its importance. There's a lot of unknowns going forward, and that kind of led to my question. And I don't want to dodge your question on who the decent journalists are. It could be the Ben Swans, Cheryl Atkinson, people going independent, trying to get their own money at Substack.
Yeah, I think it's got to be somebody youngish. And I think you're right. It's somebody at Substack, somebody who's skilled on social media. You look at people who are skillful, like I think Glenn Greenwald is very skillful on Twitter. I think Alex Berenson Jordan Schachtel is skilled at Twitter. You have to use the tools of our time, like Hazlitt did.
Yeah, but even those guys, as good as they are, they're limited from their past, their context from the left. And a lot of our friends on the right are limited. They don't want to take on some of their friends that are funding their causes at pharma, big telecom, big banking. So I haven't seen the comprehensive person yet who's got it all right. Ben Swan's almost there. There's a few others. So, that's a good topic to discuss. And I was going to ask you, what legislative changes might our friends in the GOP push if they regain control this fall? They won't go as far as we want. I'm sure they're going to waste a lot of time with oversight investigations. Some of the folks in the remnant that Dave mentioned are going to want a real handcuffing of their ability to repeat this tyranny. Limits on emergency powers, limits on sacrificing liberty for exceptions around emergencies, some comprehensive handcuffs to protect our liberty from these corrupted, tyrants. Have you thought about those kind of legislative changes from your old hat as a congressional chief of staff?
Well, if Republicans were smart, they would become the state and local party. And they would use their time in the majority, however brief. And, who knows, maybe we'll get a Republican president next. I don't know. But they would use their time in the majority to roll back some of the federalization of what ought to be wholly within state purviews. And you'd have to start with the police and health power to ensure that nothing like COVID restrictions could ever be considered again at the federal level. Because I think what we have to push now is this new growing sense of regionalism, that people are viewing themselves more as a resident of Florida or California or Texas than just an American only. I think that's a healthy thing. I think it's the only way forward. We're not going to convince 150 million 150 million somewhat progressive people, maybe 50 million of them are deep progressive people. We're just not going to convince them. We don't have a lifetimes to do that. And, all of us, regardless of our political bent, have an ability to view outcomes through our own filters and say, well, such and such events, no, those don't disqualify my worldview. Those actually support my worldview, and here's why, right? We all have that. So I don't think you can sort of present things like this bloody history of the 20th century, for example, to progressives and say, see, you were wrong, we were right. It doesn't work that way. So we don't have time for that. So I think separation is more important than persuasion at this point. And so if Republicans could, I don't think Republicans really think this way. But if they did, they should get the majority in the House and Senate and push as much down to the states, and let the DeSantises be the DeSantises, and let California go a different way. I don't care if California has a single payer healthcare system. They got 40 million people. That's way bigger than countries like Norway, which have one. I don't care if they make UC Berkeley and UC Irvine and Stanford free. I don't care if they have highly progressive income tax rates. I don't care if they have some sort of climate change legislation at the state level. I don't care if they ban firearms. Talk to Brian McClanahan. Nobody thought the Second Amendment applied to states. at the time of the Bill of Rights. I think this is the way forward. But the only way to convince the left that federalism and decentralization are viable and in their interests is to have them suffer some really painful electoral losses, like they did with Hillary losing to Trump. I mean, that really shook progressives psychologically. And we need more of that so that they will begin to say, hey, maybe our progressive arc is not as inevitable across all 50 states as we thought. And maybe it would actually benefit us to give up some things at the federal level in order to have more of what we want right here and now in the blue states. And I think that's the peaceable and humane way going forward. And so I don't, it's not a Republican versus Democrat thing, because I don't really believe in Republicans, but the right is at least a more fertile ground for our arguments, I believe, than the left.
And that's a good argument and discussion for another day. There's so many that emanate from this rich discussion. We've run out of time. If someone wants to unmute themselves and ask a last question, go ahead and blurt it out. Otherwise, Jeff, why don't you give your last word and testament and tell folks how to reach you?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Jeff Deist, all one word. And, I really appreciate what Charlie's been doing with the vaccine issue and with the health freedom issue and with what we might call this pharma medical complex, which is bearing down on us. I mean, Charlie and I can remember September 11th, and we can remember that sinking feeling in our stomachs, where it wasn't so much that we were worried about another terrorist attack. No, the pit in our stomach was, what is government going to do in response to this? That was the pit in our stomach. And so that was only 20 years ago, folks. Seems like a lifetime. At that time, we would have thought, okay, terrorism is going to be the excuse, the justification for tyranny at home. And indeed it was. The Patriot Act, Homeland Security, financial crackdowns, et cetera. But, I could never have guessed that a virus would become the next great leap forward. It just wasn't on my radar screen, and yet here we are. So thank you, Charlie, for doing this.
Yeah, and folks, read those authors. Jeff and I and most libertarian folks today love any biography of Mencken to get a real sense of what life is like 100 years ago. Knock for some just knock you off your feet writing on the bigger ideas, etc. So thank you, Jeff, very much.
So what about your wealth? If your money could actually talk to you, would you listen to it? Well, with the DNA Network Academy, your money actually can talk to you. And it's going to tell you just what it told this client. This family had over 24 debts, mortgages, car loans, the works. They were on track to take 20 years to pay it all off, and instead did it in 8.5. Plus, they did it without refinancing, making more money, or even changing their lifestyle. So find out for yourself with a free analysis that is completely confidential. No personal information, no social security numbers, no credit checks, none of that nonsense. But what is exciting is that the outcome of that report you receive is a guaranteed outcome for you. To get that report, head on over to bit.ly/debt to wealth. You will arrive at this simple form. Fill it in, as simple as lender number 1 and credit card number 2. What really matters is the accuracy of your numbers. You'll be able to see that if instead of 20 years or whatever your number is, that you may actually be out of debt and on your way to wealth in as little as 6.3 years like this client.